Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I wanted to talk about all things experimental when it comes to books. Now, I should say at the beginning, I'm sort of using my own definition of experimental here. So there may be some books on this list that you think, they're not that experimental, there may be loads of other books that you think that, this book is absolutely a prime example of experimental fiction. Why has it not made this list? Maybe because I've not read it, but it may also just be that I hadn't thought about it, or I'm focusing on a different area of experimental fiction. And, in all honesty, there are so many books that would fall under the idea of experimental fiction. But some of the ones here that I really wanted to talk about are ones that I think do really clever things with the form of the novel. So the way that the novel is either structured or the way that the words are on the page. And that's especially sort of true for a good few of these, about why I love certain books and how they achieve certain things. It's also worth saying that, as much as I love some of these books for being experimental, that doesn't necessarily mean I always love that kind of thing. And it doesn't also mean that these books are perfect examples of it. Although a few of these I think are bloody brilliant and I would recommend pretty much to everyone. But I think it is well worth saying that, just because a book is experimental doesn't automatically mean it's fun or exciting. Sometimes it does feel like an author is just sort of being like, I am very clever and none of you understand me. And that's exactly how it's felt with some experimental books I've read. Luckily not these ones, but let's delve in. It seems like a good place to start, really, to bring up some of the kind of older, sort of more famous kind of examples. Many people talk about Virginia Woolf in particular being a very experimental writer, and in many ways she's completely transformed how we see the novel in some ways. I'm thinking especially of novels like Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando, although I need to read a few more others of hers, because I realise I've probably only read about 3-4 of her novels, and there are a few more. But I think what Virginia Woolf does so brilliantly in both Orlando and in Mrs. Dalloway is just really expand how we think about writing. So Mrs. Dalloway, for example, is written in this very sort of stream of consciousness tone, and that, although it's a bit more common to see that with some books sort of now, that wasn't always the case. It was quite bold and daring and innovative when she did it. So it's really well worth kind of talking about her in that. So Mrs. Dalloway follows this character, Clarissa Dalloway, through her day. And on paper, it doesn't sound like it should be the most exciting thing in the world. It's following a character as she goes shopping, gets ready for like a dinner party that's coming later in the day, or a party, and just kind of gets things together as she walks around London. Doesn't on paper sound like the most exciting thing, but I think that's often where experimental books can be at their most exciting. And for me, what I absolutely adore about Mrs. Dalloway is how it brings some of those ideas to light, and we've got these really brilliant descriptions of London. Big Ben is a regular presence throughout the whole book, where we kind of have the sound of time in the background, and that starts creating these really interesting things where the time in her own head is so out of joint with the actual time around her. Physical time being very strict and focused, but actually across her day, time kind of concatenates and moves and sometimes expands and shortens and does all these really incredible things. So anyway, I really love that. And Orlando by Virginia Woolf also has these brilliant things that happen where characters suddenly, this kind of character changes sort of sex and gender in some ways throughout the book, and it's not always commented on or brought up that much, and I think it's just so brilliantly done. I remember writing an essay about this at uni, being like, this book is incredible, and kind of being so excited about so many of the themes and the way it does it. It also brings to mind a novel by one of my absolute favourite authors, Jan Martel, who's more widely known for The Life of Pi, but wrote an incredible book, in my opinion, called Self, in which the main character changes gender several times, but in a way that's almost completely not commented on. I think what's also really exciting is the way that Jan Martel uses the page in this book. At one point, the page completely breaks down into two halves, where on one side you have the character's thoughts, and the other side you have the character's description of what's actually happening. I've got the book here as an example. I absolutely love this book. I need to reread it. It's been a very long time. Maybe I'll hate it now. Who knows? But at one point there is a really horrific scene, a very violent, graphic scene happening. And on one side of the page, as I was saying, we get the character's thoughts, and the other we get what's actually happening. And so, for example, I'm not sure how easy it is to see there, but we've got, for example, the character talking about, you know, I stayed in the bath for hours, shivering in the hot water, thinking nothing, washing obsessively. And on the other side, we've got her thoughts at that time, which are completely blank. And then at one point, the word pain just starts appearing in her thoughts. So it's sort of blank, 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 pain, blank, 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 pain. And then at one point, yeah, it just becomes, so for example, again, I'm not sure how much you can see there, but it just sort of starts saying fear, 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 just endlessly. And I just thought this was really brilliantly done in terms of playing with how text works on the page. And I think it's also just really exciting because some of these books, what I love about them is because of how they don't conform to sort of the standard of what we kind of see with text and what we expect. It also means that they are such a unique reading experience. It means that when we read these books, we get such a different experience to how it might be for if we heard it as an audiobook. Although an example that I think is a really clever version of this that's very closely linked in my mind to a book like Self is Little Scratch by Rebecca Watson. Now, I've spoken about this separately in my video about chatter and about internal monologues, which I also talk about Mrs. Dalloway. As you can tell, I really like that book. And I also talk in that video about Ducks Newburyport, which Kel Surprise I'm going to be talking about in a bit. Again, what's really clever is the way that the words are on the page for that. Although I listened to it as an audiobook, I've since seen what it looks like on the page, and it's such a different experience because you've got all these sort of interweaving thoughts, and it's a real challenge for how you make that work as an audiobook or if you were reading it out. You know, thinking back to Yann Martel's Self, how do you read that out? Because you've got two competing voices. You need two people speaking at once. And, you know, sometimes whole pages are just blank or just have the word "oh" on it. The same for Little Scratch. You've just got, you know, the words kind of dart around the page. And I think that is a really great description and sort of way of displaying just actually how thoughts sometimes work. Our thoughts don't follow linear patterns that can very neatly be fixed, fitted into sentences. That's not how things work. Thoughts are these kind of wild sort of horses that we try to rein in and make fit into sentences. So I just think absolutely brilliantly done in Rebecca Watson's Little Scratch as well. And since I mentioned it, Ducks Newburyport is a fine book to bring up right now. So although it doesn't play around as much necessarily with the text on the page in terms of the structure, obviously it does do a lot in terms of how it talks about how it just portrays thoughts. It's just an ongoing stream of consciousness with the fact that blah blah blah, the fact that blah blah blah. Sometimes it's just links, pages upon pages of various acronyms of cleaning products or government agencies or TV programs or whatever. It's brilliant. Again, I've spoken about this book in so much length in so many other videos, but it is essentially this story about a housewife making pies, reflecting on the world, and how the sort of personal and the political start interweaving, and how her thoughts and her obsessions and her anxieties about various things really mirror the scariness of the world around her and around us all really at the moment, particularly in the kind of current climate. And so I think it does some really clever, brilliant things. And a lot of people talk about how, I've seen it kind of written quite a bit about how Ducks Newburyport is kind of a modern version of Ulysses in some ways by James Joyce. I have mixed feelings about James Joyce's Ulysses. Part of me loves so much of what it does, and it was deeply inventive, especially at the time. I think it came out in the same year as either Mrs. Dalloway or Orlando. It was around those exact same time, that exact same time. And you know, it follows this one character through one day in Dublin. There's even a reading challenge where people try to read the entire book in the 24 hours of the day. I want to say it's James Joyce's birthday, I want to say, or maybe the date that's listed in the book. I can't remember exactly, but people try to do this sort of James Joyce readathon. and try and read Ulysses in the one day, which is quite challenging because it's big. It's, you know, for a book that's only focused around being on, you know, one day, it's a good sort of 600-700 pages of quite dense prose at times, and it's, you know, a lot going on. But I think, you know, I see why the comparisons to Ulysses are made for Ducks Newburyport, but I think Ducks Newburyport is such a clever invention all of its own, just detailing these inner thoughts of a character who we probably often ignore in sort of mainstream fiction. You know, we don't often just focus on a housewife making pies, thinking kind of often fairly mundane thoughts. We don't do that normally, do we? You know, we normally have really interesting kick-ass character, or you know, character to whom these other big scary things are happening. I mean, you know, we don't often get a character just sort of making pies and thinking about whether she'll be able to afford you know, rent based on the amount that she charges for her pies, and about Trump and some various other things. So I just think it's really, really clever and absolutely brilliant. And although it doesn't necessarily play around too much with text on the page, just the sheer fact that you've sometimes got 70 pages of one ongoing sentence, I think is brilliant. And that's, I think, often where the James Joyce comparison comes in, because the final chapter, I want to say, or one of the final chapters of Ulysses, is around 70 pages, which is done in, I think, 5 sentences or so. And, you know, you've got the character sort of, you know, with no real punctuation either. So the character just sort of says things like, yes, I said yes, he said blah, blah, blah. And yeah, for all of my sort of feelings about the book, and sometimes I love the idea of it, sometimes I hate it. I kind of want to go back and reread it. I'm also kind of scared that I'll hate it if I do, or that I'll really love it and I'll be forced to kind of reckon with some of my demons from it. Especially as when I was at uni, one of my supervisors was like an expert, a world expert on Joyce, and so imagine having to sort of read it with that kind of thought over your shoulder of, oh gosh, I'd better like be good at this because he's gonna know. But anyway, so that aside, you know, and I mean, that I can't also be too mad at James Joyce for Ulysses, because it also did spawn a Kate Bush song, and I adore Kate Bush, and she her song re-released as Flower on the Mountain after she was able to get the rights to from the James Joyce estate to use words from the final chapter of Ulysses is kind of in there. So really clever and really inventive, but some sort of silly shenanigans as well in terms of how these books are structured and how they're made, and how it kind of both confounds and frustrates the reader. You know, sections of Ulysses just go completely sideways, and we're suddenly seeing all of the action in written as a play, you know, play format with kind of character name, dialogue, stage directions, everything. The same way Ducks Newburyport, we suddenly get these complete left turns where we are reading the story about an escaped wildcat, and then we get whole sections where the character is just talking about, you know, toothpaste or something. It's brilliant. It's really good. I know it doesn't sound it. 1,000-page book with hardly any sentence breaks, all kind of stream of consciousness about a housewife thinking about the state of the world. But I think it does something really quite exquisite in the way it approaches this. So I think it's worth it. But yes, that's all that. A more recent example of some of what I'm talking about as well can be seen in the work of Jenny Offal. Particularly, I'm thinking the book Weather. So this was shortlisted for the Women's Prize and is such a curveball. I just think it's so great because, you know, a large part of the book, you know, some parts of it are sort of written up as a questionnaire or a survey. Some parts are just sort of words kind of really dotted around in different ways on the page. But it does something really quite profound. I mean, although it didn't always work for me, I think there is so much that's brilliant about it, because it really plays with this idea of, you know, we're talking about environmental destruction, this really big, scary thing, and the text starts sort of playing around with us to really make us feel uncomfortable in various ways about certain things, which I just think is really profound and really well done. It also made me think a little bit of Emma McBride, I hope I'm saying that name right, who I've not actually read Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, which was kind of, you know, a really groundbreaking novel in the sense that some of the words will kind of combine, some of them have, like, the letters sort of spill from one word into another. all kind of while talking about a character going, you know, sort of processing trauma, which I think is really powerful. I read Strange Hotel of hers, which does sort of similar things. It really kind of flies off on these little tangents and tries sort of playing around with language. And we're watching as a character sort of jets around and thinks back over various places that they've been and lovers they've had. And in that sense, I think the experimental nature of the text really adds to the form, and the form then really adds to the content. Like, we're talking about traumatic events, or we're talking about memory loss, and the text reflects that. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, and just so well rendered with her, that I think, yeah, Jenny Offal is kind of someone who I'm really excited to see some more of, and same for Emma McBride. I just think both of them are really innovating how fiction works and how it can work, what the novel form can be, and they're not afraid to kind of create these works that are sometimes really quite short, where, you know, some pages have almost nothing on them, but they do something really quite profound and quite clever, and so that's all really good. One book as well that really got me so excited about experimental books, and I think it's probably one of the first really very experimental books I read, that for me just kind of absolutely filled me with joy, and just threw me, because I didn't think novels could do this. I didn't think it was allowed to do this, and that's House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. So this book is kind of a book within a book within a film within an editor's comment within a, you know, there's a lot of kind of many sort of leveled kind of things going on, but essentially, you know, these characters, these men find a videotape, or they find someone talking about a film that may or may not have existed, and they also talk about critique, but you've also got this editor's voice going all the way through. There are sometimes footnotes that send you to various parts of the book. Sometimes the parts of the book it sends you to have no relevance to what's actually there, or at least doesn't seem to. There's at one point this incredible moment where they are going into a room that is getting smaller and smaller the further they go in, and the text on the page suddenly starts shrinking. So instead of, you know, filling the full margin, the next room they go into, the text will be like that, and then like this, and slowly until you have about 2 or 3 words on a page. And it's weird, it just creates such a remarkable effect, because you, instead of just describing a room getting smaller, you are physically seeing the text shrinking around you. And I just thought it was so clever. I know it's a bit hit and miss, and for me, Mark Z. Danielewski has also been quite hit and miss. 50-year-old Sword, really loved, not quite sure what it was about, but enjoyed the ride. Only Revolutions, did not like. Only Revolutions is the whole idea that there is, you will read 100, you'll basically go through 180 words and then flip to have the other 180 words to keep kind of the rotation of a 360-degree circle, which is a great idea. I just didn't enjoy the actual story when I was there, so that made a difference. But anyway, back to House of Leaves. What I thought was so brilliant about it is, like, this text really plays with you, to the point where at one point it switches entirely and goes into the second person. So it starts directly addressing you as the reader. And there's a whole passage where it says, "Do not look behind you. Behind you there are shadows and monsters." And it starts describing, you know, these dark things behind you. And that the second you look around, they will get you. My friend, I felt really bad. I recommended this book to a friend who loved it, but she was reading that exact passage whilst on a night bus going through quite a rough area of London. And so she's like already on this bus thinking, I'm gonna get stabbed. And then she reads that passage and hates me. But I absolutely, I just thought this book does some really great, incredible things. And I thought it was thoroughly exciting to really shift how we approach various things. Another example is a book I really want to talk about, which I've got just here, which is The Mezzanine by Nicholson Barker. So this is a story all about a character going up an escalator to the mezzanine floor, which is so stupid and such a ridiculous idea. It's almost outrageous that he's allowed to get away with this as a book. It's about 130, 140 pages long, and the character himself keeps on going off on these tangents. So that's how we get enough to kind of go up this escalator as 140 pages. But the character will start talking about his shoelaces, and then he'll start reflecting on the durability of shoelaces and about why one shoelace might break before the other. Does that mean that, for example, we put a lot more stress on our left shoelace than our right one? Are we tying one of them too tightly? Is that why? Where did he last get his shoelaces? Oh, he went to the shops, and when he was at the shops he did this. And it's really rambling and silly. And at times, you know, bits will go off on full rambles and tangents. There will be footnotes. So sometimes, you know, you're already reading an incredibly rambly tangent, and then you'll go off on a footnote that talks all about plastic straws over paper straws, and how companies created these straws to kind of be heavy enough to sink and stay down in the can instead of floating right to the top, and how they do that by reducing the slot so that all these bubbles can't escape, and all these ridiculous things. And you just think, what on earth am I reading? But it's kind of so funny because he really goes for it. The commitment is there to the joke and to the silliness. But I think that kind of level of experimentation is also quite exciting. It really opens up our idea of what a novel can be. You know, a novel of someone going up an escalator technically does have a beginning, middle and end. It follows that kind of strategy, even if it weaves off, but it really messes with our sense of time, because 140 pages have literally described what's probably like 20 seconds of real life, and that seems absurd that we could express this out. You know, often with novels that take place over one day or over a fixed period of time, it's quite believable, because even if we read it in one sitting, or even if we space it out over a long amount of time, often the amount of time we read it for isn't as long as the thing that happens, right? You know, a book that's set over the span of 24 hours often might take us, you know, 4, 5, 6 hours to read. And that makes sense for us because we understand that some of those hours we don't need to see every single second and every single moment. But I think this book does some really fun and silly things. It's just so stupid. Yeah, but I'm kind of glad for that level of experimentation and really pushing the envelope in terms of what fiction can be. So that was the first part of talking about experimental books. I realised that these are getting quite long, so I've separated these out into two parts. The first part is just all talking about these books that you'd have heard, books that I've found really enjoyable, and then I wanted to come in the second part to talking about two books in particular, which are both by Stephen Hall, because he's released a new book, Maxwell's Demon, that I wanted to speak about in more detail. So please do head over onto part 2 when it comes out to check that out and hear me babble on about how much I loved it. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. Take care, and please do recommend any cool and experimental books that you have read that you've found are really exciting and do fun, experimental, different things with text. Thank you, and I hope you're doing really well. Bye bye.